again?
Yep, it's in process now.
Okay, let us begin. So welcome to all of you to this webinar, very timely webinar, the U.S. military-industrial complex and the assault on Gaza. I'm Paul Shannon with Massachusetts Peace Action, and we have some very interesting guests this evening. Let me just say that we have a few other very interesting webinars coming up soon. On February 19th, we have a webinar put on by the War Industry Resistors Network on the dissenters, this wonderful national anti-war group of students. Here in Massachusetts, their main organization seems to be on University of Mass, where they have conducted a number of civil disobedience and other demonstrations on the Gaza issue and Raytheon's connection to it. And then on February 15th, which is before that, obviously, we have a webinar teach-in on both Gaza and Ukraine. It's called Two Ceasefires. We're trying to push that idea of the need for a ceasefire and negotiations both in Gaza and in Ukraine. And our speakers that night, it's really an online webinar with Medea Benjamin, Stephen Kinzer here at the Boston Globe, and who was the third one, Cole? You remember? We have another speaker in there. Dennis Kucinich, the former representative from Ohio. So that will be our teach-in on at the same time at 7 o'clock on February 15th. And then for those of you in Massachusetts, we have a webinar on the 24th, Saturday the 24th. That is not going to be a webinar. That is going to be a rally, downtown crossing in Boston on the second anniversary of the Ukraine war, in which again we will be focusing on the need for a ceasefire in Ukraine and a ceasefire in Gaza. So those events are coming up. You can find them all on the Mass Peace Action website. Let me just get rid of this phone. And let me just put, if I can, in the chat here, the link to a few of these, events. See if they come in here. So there are some links that you can grab for some of those events. So without further ado, let us get into tonight's program. You know, I've personally just become aware of this new, what I thought was a completely new program at American Friends Service Committee out of Philadelphia, although this project is based in California. It's called the Action Center for Corporate Accountability. Some of you who go way back may remember the old AFSC NARMIC project, North American Research on the Military-Industrial Complex. Well, here's a rendition of that, a rebirth, if you want, of that old project. The Action Center's mission is to expose, isolate, and reduce corporate complicity in state violence. It especially focuses on corporations involved in incarceration and immigrant detention, the Israeli occupation, and the border industry, which is so important right now in terms of the crisis we're in and all the fighting going on in Congress. It promotes economic activism and corporate social responsibility initiatives through strategic support, corporate research, education, and training. The Action Center provides information and tools for corporate engagement, accountability, and keep this in mind, divestment initiatives, for those of you who are considering that tactic. Its ultimate goal is to support the building of wide movements that can influence, limit, and monitor corporate abuse. So this sounds like just what we need these days. And I want to introduce the representatives from the Action Center for Corporate Accountability. First, I'll mention Dr. Dov Baum, who is the Director of Corporate Accountability and Research at American Friends Service Committee, leading the Action Center for Corporate Accountability. She was the co-founder of the Coalition for Women for Peace in Israel, of Who Profits Research Institute, that's the name of the organization, Who Profits Research Institute, and of Black Laundry Direct Action Group. Dov is a Ph.D. in math from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Dr. Noam Perry is the Strategic Research Coordinator for the Action Center. He coordinates the Investigate project, researching corporate complicity in state violence and human rights violations around the world. Born and raised in Tel Aviv, Noam holds a Ph.D. in law and public policy from Northeastern University. Davi Sherman is an investigative research fellow with the AFSC's Action Center for Corporate Accountability. She researches corporate complicity in the prison industrial complex, migrant control, and the Israeli occupation of Palestinian lands. She received her graduate degree in criminal justice policy from the London School of Economics. So let us all welcome our speakers tonight, and let us begin. Dov, you want to take control here?
Yeah, thank you so much, Paul, and thank you all of you for taking the time to join us today. I'm kind of excited because this is our first webinar as a team, all three of us together, and presenting this new Action Center on Corporate Accountability. Let me share my screen and show you some visuals. Let's see if that works. Yeah, so we are a project of the American Friends Service Committee, and as Paul said, we see ourselves as a continuation of an old project that started out in the 70s and 80s, started out as a project against the war in Vietnam and then against apartheid in South Africa, tracking corporate complicity in those big state violence projects, but also working very closely with activists that ran specific campaigns holding these corporations accountable. Likewise, we do the same. Our project actually started back in 2012, and this is one of our main products since then. It is called Investigate. It is a website, it is a database, and it is a product of our research for some years now that we are very proud of. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. What we publish on Investigate is information about specific corporate complicity in specific violations of human rights as part of the systems of mass incarceration or the militarization of the US-Mexico border, or mass surveillance of communities inside the US, and the Israeli occupation of Palestine. And we publish this information in a format that is most useful for investors, not because we are an investor service. We're not. We are really a grassroots support system, but because we want to support divestment campaigns. We want to support students that ask their university to withdraw their investment in such companies. We want to support unions. We want to support churches, any institution and people inside institutions that call for divestment. And a lot of our work is also in support of specific such organizations and groups around the country and around the world that are trying to hold a corporation accountable. Usually such campaigns are information heavy. They need a lot of information that is not easily accessible. So we help with corporate research. We help with preparing them to the meeting with the company or with investors that use a different language than activists usually speak. So we act as translators sometimes, or just as strategy consultant, or just as connecting them to other other supports, other organizations, other resources, somebody to help them write a press release, and so on. And over the years, I think we have been involved in many dozens of such campaigns and learned a lot about what works and what doesn't, and we use that experience to consult on new campaigns. I myself am an Israeli. I grew up and I spent most of my adult life in Israel as an activist against the occupation. And since October 7th, as many of you, I'm horrified by the news. I'm trying to join protests out there. This is me on the left in a demonstration just this last Saturday against Chevron, which is one of our corporate targets. If you ask about it in the Q&A, we'll tell you more. And I don't know if you saw that, but in many of these demonstrations now we have those white kites. The white kites became a symbol after a famous Palestinian poet, Rifat al-Harir, was killed by one of the Israeli airstrikes. And he wrote a poem about transforming himself just a few weeks before he was killed, about the transformation he will go through once he was killed. He was expecting that into a story, into a telling, into a white kite. And I'm telling you the story of Rifat al-Harir and want to encourage you to read more about him, because he was an important partner of our work here, our colleagues, and some of the projects we did in AFSC. We also published this book, Light in Gaza, of short stories from inside Gaza before this current attack. And Rifat was one of the contributors to this book, and you can find it now online for free in Haymarket Books. And I want to mention him because he also gave us a call for action before he was killed. And this is from his Twitter X account. Like many others in Gaza, he was posting pictures of shells and ammunition that were being used in the attacks on civilians inside Gaza. And he says these are American-made shells. And there is this picture of, whatever they could see of the markings of these shells. And we see that as a call for action. We see that as an invitation for accountability, as the need from people inside Gaza to hold these companies accountable and to track who is sending these weapons that have destroyed their lives. So I will pause here and pass it to my colleague Noam, who actually leads our research project on these companies.
Thank you, Dov. It's really great to be here today. And yeah, we started in October, really, to try to figure out what weapons Israel is using in Gaza and also in the attacks that are related to that. There's an increase in violence in the West Bank, there's attacks in Lebanon, in Syria, in other places. And we try to keep it all together in this webpage. As you can see, these are just the names of the companies, but if you actually go to the URL, there's the story of what each company does, what weapons it produces that Israel is using right now. All of these companies make weapons that Israel uses right now. These are weapons that we have evidence of their use. Some of them have been used in attacks that are suspected as war crimes. As you can see, we have more than 40 companies here. Some of the names are the same as the list that Dov showed in the beginning from the Narmic days. You know, the history rhymes. So we have the largest weapons manufacturers that have been the same, even though some names changed. But you know, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, RTX, or Raytheon, L3 Harris, General Dynamics, and all of those. We have some names here of smaller arms manufacturers, companies that even I haven't heard of until just now. And we also, if you notice, have some names of companies that we don't usually associate with the weapons industry, like car manufacturers. We have Toyota, Mercedes, Ford. We have DJI, which is a Chinese company that makes drones that you can buy on Amazon, commercial drones. So actually many companies that don't usually are considered part of the arms industry are actually part of the arms industry. Caterpillar is a great example that Davi will talk about later. We have Palantir on this list. Palantir is a software company, but it actually behaves like a weapons company. So before we go to Davi and she'll give us some specific examples of how some specific weapon systems have been used, I wanted to share some insights and some trends that we've seen since the beginning of the attacks in October. And I want to share also, before I continue, that this is a joint project. We are the lead, but we're also doing this in collaboration with two Israeli organizations. One is New Profile, which runs the database of Israeli military and security exports, or DIMSE, which also started as a project of the American Friends Service Committee. And the Israeli organization Who Profits, who we also already heard that Dov was the co-founder of. So here are some of the trends. Dov, can you go to the next slide, please? The first thing we observe is that most of it is not new. Like I said, some of the companies on this list have been involved in weapons manufacturing for ages. As a lot of you know, Gaza has been under repeated attacks by Israel in the last 20 years. So the things you see here in yellow are really the main 6 attacks, including this current one. Each one of them with hundreds or thousands of people killed. And by nature of war, it takes time for a military to adopt new weapons. So in fact, most of the weapons that we see used now, we've seen them being used in 2021, in 2014, in 2008. Some of these weapons haven't changed much since then. There are, of course, new weapons, and I'll share that in a minute. But there is a cycle here, and every time there's a major attack, we see a lot of the same companies and the same products and the same weapons being used. Next slide. As many of you probably know, the vast majority of the weapons that Israel uses in general and in these attacks right now specifically are from the United States. There has been an aerial convoy with more than 200 planes, sometimes landing daily, sometimes more than one cargo plane a day, carrying weapons to Israel. Some of these are fulfillment of orders that were placed before, last year or the year before. Some of them are new orders that are rushed right now. And we have seen more than 200 cargo planes. We've seen some ships as well. There are other countries that are sending weapons to Israel, Germany, Italy, some others, but the bulk of the transfers that we see are from the United States. A lot of the weapons are bought through the Foreign Military Sales Program. Dov, we can go to the next slide. The Foreign Military Sales Program is a program of the United States, which, again, as I'm sure some of you may know, the United States funds the Israeli military to the tune of $3.4 billion a year for specifically to buy weapons, specifically in the United States. So in a way, this is a subsidy that the United States government gives to US arms manufacturers and a gift to the Israeli military from the American people. Even some weapons that are Israeli, even some that are made in Israel, can be purchased in whole or in part using the foreign military sales program. So here are just a few examples. The newest battle tank, the Merkava 5, and also before that, the Merkava 4, which you can see on the upper left corner here. Its engine is actually made here in the United States. On the upper right corner is Israel's newest armored personnel carrier. It's called the Eitan. And even though it's Israeli developed and Israeli made, the hull or the structure, the big structure from metal is made here in the United States by a company named Oshkosh. In the middle, at the top middle, there's an armored vehicle called the David. And it was developed specifically for the Israeli military during the Second Intifada, some 20 years ago, by an Israeli company. It is still manufactured by an Israeli company, but in a factory in Alabama. And all of these are bought by using the foreign military sales program with our money, our taxpayers' money here in the United States. And of course, on the right side at the bottom is the Iron Dome interceptors, which were developed in Israel by Rafael, which is an Israeli company owned by the Israeli government, and are made. Some of them are made here by Raytheon RTX. Next slide. Another trend that we see is a lot of secrecy. So actually, it's very hard to do this research right now. There's a lot of secrecy about what the United States is sending Israel. It's striking if you compare it to the lists that the United States publishes about the weapons it sends to Ukraine. You can go to the next slide. This is just an example from the State Department's website. This is a partial list. I didn't copy all of it because it would be more than one slide. But this is what the United States publishes that it sends to Ukraine. We don't have such a comparable list about what is being sent to Israel. Next slide. Let's skip that maybe, because I see that I'm short on time. These are some examples of the newest weapons. Like in every war, Israel is testing new weapons, using some weapons for the first time. These are just examples of weapons that are being used right now, making their debut in these attacks. I'll just name the drone on the bottom left corner. This is a DJI drone made in China. And Israel, you can buy it, the drone, and Israel bought dozens of these and has modified them. Now they can carry guns, they can carry different kinds of weapons, and they wreak havoc. Palestinians report that they are shooting them like snipers. Let's go to the next slide. Another thing to note is that some weapons we can't see. So there was a great expose in 972 magazine about how this is an AI-powered war, artificial intelligence. We know that Israel uses multiple artificial intelligence platforms, software to generate targets at a pace faster than ever before. We know that many of them are developed in-house by the Israeli military, by its various technological units, and we also know that there are companies that are providing tools that enable Israel to do this better and enable Israel to host these platforms on some platforms by some of these companies that you see on the screen. So I'll stop there. We can skip the next slide as well. And I'll hand it over to David to talk about some specific weapons.
Thanks, Noam, and thanks everyone for joining. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit and focus on 3 US companies that, like Noam mentioned, have been supplying Israel with weapons, not just currently, but for decades. Should come as no surprise, I'm sure, to map of folks that RTX is the first example we're going to go over. So RTX, formerly Raytheon, has been supplying various types of missiles and bombs, components for Israel's fighter jets, its main warplanes, and components for military drones and other weapon systems. This slide that you see now, the photos represent only a very small fraction of the weapons that RTX is providing to Israel. If you look at the photo in the top left corner, you'll see what's called a GBU-28 bunker buster bomb. This is a 19-foot long RTX bomb that weighs 5,000 pounds that Israel's used in its attacks on Gaza, including in war crimes, so targeting civilian infrastructure, including residential buildings. But the use of RTX bombs, of course, dates much farther back than Israel's current attacks on Gaza. In 2009, for example, Amnesty International found bomb fragments of 500-pound Raytheon bombs in the aftermath of Israel's 2008 to 2009 attacks. One more that I'll highlight is this naval gun that's shown in the middle of the slide. This is a system, a rapid fire gun system that RTX, that's integrated into Israel's warships, which it uses to enforce its illegal naval blockade of the Gaza Strip. Again, this isn't a new weapon system. In 2021, Palestinian fishermen in Gaza who are restricted to a really limited area off of the coast reported being fired at by these weapons on an almost daily basis. Dove, if you could switch to the next slide, please. It, of course, comes as no surprise that these companies profit off of war making everywhere, but profit off of Israel's attacks on Gaza in particular. In the immediate aftermath of October 7th, for example, RTX's stock prices, along with those of other major weapons manufacturers, increased significantly. And Dove, if you could switch to the next slide, please. Not only do these companies profit off of selling these weapons and supporting Israel's attacks on Gaza, its CEOs and high-level executives also brag about how these companies line their pockets with the weapons that it sells. So this is CEO of RTX speaking on a call with investors about how Israel's replenishment of its weapons stocks will inevitably benefit Raytheon because it'll drive DoD budget increases, which of course will go toward purchasing weapons from companies like Raytheon and sending them to Israel. Dove, if you could go to the next slide. It's really important to note that while all of the companies we're talking about are involved in war making and manufacturing weapons of war, this isn't all that they do. So the weapons that it manufactures for war also influence the technologies and weapons that they manufacture for use in the US. In the top right photo, you'll see a CBP maritime drone, that's Customs and Border Protection, one of two major immigration authorities in the US. And CBP uses this drone, which is equipped with RTX surveillance technology, to patrol the US-Mexico border. This sort of funny-looking tool in the picture on the bottom right is actually a Raytheon, an RTX weapon that was originally developed for use in Afghanistan and Iraq. It's a pain ray, a less lethal pain ray that emits radiation, and that was repackaged into a smaller tool called the Silent Guardian that RTX then marketed to US prisons and jails. Dove, if you could go to the next slide. Another major weapons manufacturer, of course, is General Dynamics. And while time doesn't permit me to go over every single weapon that it's been sending to Israel and has been for decades, perhaps most relevant to today's conversation and Israel's current attacks on Gaza is its manufacturing of what you can see in these photos, 155 millimeter artillery shells. Israel is using these, firing them from both tanks and portable mobile artillery systems to fire them into civilian infrastructure, hospitals, homes in the Gaza Strip and along the Lebanon border. And this is despite the fact that major human rights organizations like Oxfam have warned that their use is essentially inherently a war crime. These weapons are indiscriminate. They cause mass harm to civilians. In this photo of this young girl, Dunya, pictured here, the Israeli military fired these shells into Nasser Hospital in Gaza, killing the 12-year-old girl shown here as she sought refuge and treatment after already being the target of an Israeli airstrike that killed her parents and 2 of her siblings. Dove, if you could go to the next slide. Again, just like we saw with RTX, General Dynamics CFOs and executives are really proud of these weapons being battleground tested on Palestinians and proven in these attacks over and over again to cause mass harm, which again, as we know, lines the pockets of these weapons companies. So here you can see CFO having said on a call with investors that while the Israel situation is obviously a terrible one, if you look at the demand potential coming out of General Dynamics artillery, including these 155 millimeter shells causing mass harm to civilians, well, that's great for General Dynamics' bottom line. Next slide, please. General Dynamics also manufactures bombs, just like RTX, that are used in war crimes and have been used by Israel in all of its attacks against Gaza. This photo shows this massive 40-foot wide crater caused by 2 Israeli airstrikes that took place between October 31st and November 1st on Jabalia refugee camp, which killed 195 Palestinians. General Dynamics also provides Israel with the Mk-80 bombs, the main bomb type used by Israel in its attacks on Gaza. I should note that a weapons analyst, a former UN weapons analyst, looked at these photos of this crater and said that in all likelihood, it was caused by either a General Dynamics bomb or a Boeing bomb. Dove, if you could go to the next slide. Again, repeating history here. With every weapons manufacturer, you see that weapons of war then influence surveillance technologies and bolster these companies' presence in the US as being complicit in the border industrial complex and the prison industrial complex. So General Dynamics creates technologies used to patrol the US-Mexico border. In the photo on the top right, you'll see these tower-mounted cameras that are used to patrol the border. The left is showing the effects of family separation policies, which General Dynamics has supported by providing services to the Office of Refugee Resettlement that reinforce family separation. Dove, if you could go to the next slide. Thank you. Noam touched on this earlier. There are weapons companies that we don't typically associate with weapons companies. We have sort of the top list of war-making companies that, of course, we all understand to be weapons manufacturers. But companies like Caterpillar, which most of us might associate with construction sites and building things, maybe even building life-sustaining sites like schools and hospitals, also supply the Israeli military with tools that are used as weapons of war. So the Israeli military uses wheel loaders, excavators, but especially bulldozers manufactured by Caterpillar in all of its attacks on Gaza, including its current ones and across the West Bank. So just to highlight a specific example, currently the Israeli military, essentially every troop conducting ground attacks in Gaza is being accompanied by an armored D9 bulldozer that's clearing roads, destroying houses, demolishing civilian infrastructure to essentially pave the way for combat troops to unleash even more destruction on civilians. The D9 bulldozers are also further weaponized and modified by Israeli weapons companies like Israel Aerospace Industries, which are modifying them and converting them into autonomous vehicles that don't need a driver. The two photos on the right, the top photo shows, it's a little bit hard to tell, but you can kind of see it in the background, an armored Caterpillar piece of heavy machinery, sort of unclear in that photo, but looks like a smaller bulldozer being used to destroy a cultural heritage site, which is a war crime. This was a monument to former President Arafat of Palestine. And this bottom photo shows another armored bulldozer being used in Gaza. Dove, if you could go to the next slide, thank you. Again, these weapons aren't just being used currently. They've been used for decades. And before I hand it off to Dove, I wanted to end on a note about activism tied into Caterpillar. So Rachel Corrie, I'm sure all of us are familiar with the story of Rachel Corrie, 23-year-old American peace activist from Washington who traveled to Gaza to demonstrate alongside with Palestinians and other internationals to protest against the Israeli military's ongoing demolition of homes, civilian infrastructure, and really all of the means of life of Palestinians in Gaza. While she was defending a home like she's pictured doing in this bottom photo on the side, she was crushed to death by a Caterpillar D9 bulldozer. And leading up to her death, she often wrote home. She wrote emails and letters to her family members, many of which mentioned specifically D9 bulldozers and bulldozers generally being used to destroy Palestinian homes and Palestinians' lives in Gaza. And in one of her letters home, she wrote, and I'll paraphrase here, she wrote this call to action calling on everyday people like all of you in this room this afternoon to drop everything in order to stand in the way of Israel's chronic and insidious genocide against Palestinians. And this, again, was in 2003, the photos of these Caterpillar bulldozers in 2003. And like Noam has said, like we'll continue to say throughout this webinar, these weapons have been used for decades. And with that, I will pass it over to Dove.
Thank you, Davi. In 2003, I remember being part of the demonstrations against the wall in the West Bank, and the moment of the killing of Rachel Corrie was very meaningful to all of us in the movement. It also was very meaningful, I think, in the US, because it was the first time when we saw students in universities calling on their universities to divest from Caterpillar. That was in UC Berkeley back then. They haven't divested until today. But this was our first corporate accountability campaign around Palestinian rights. And we've seen many of them, and I'm sure many of you have participated in many of them, targeting the weapons companies first and foremost, Caterpillar being a weapons company to that regard. And we also see demonstrations all around the country now. This was against Google, not what you usually think of as a weapons company in San Francisco, a typical strategy of a die-in. very, very, very moving for me there, because at some point everybody wearing those white cloth got out from within the cloth and were carrying white kites again. But I want to note that when we protest Google, we are asking them to do something that we think they might do. We ask them to cut their ties to Israeli apartheid and to the Israeli military and war machine, while it is not as likely that Boeing or Raytheon would do so. And that brings me to I just want to say a few comments about these campaigns. A lot of what our team is doing is to support campaigns and to help strategize with campaigns. And we want to have successful campaigns, not just symbolic protests. When we protest the military industries, we raise awareness about the tremendous support that the US is giving Israel, and we are in effect asking our representatives to stop that support. And I know that there is an action we're going to take about that today. But there is also a way of targeting companies that might step away, and also targeting other institutions. This is another very inspiring action in Brown University. Students in Brown University have asked their university to divest from the companies directly complicit in the oppression in Palestine. And since Friday, 19 students, including Jewish and Palestinian students, have started a hunger strike. So follow them on any social media platform, search for them, we can help you find them. Support them, send supportive letters. This is very moving for young people to take on the ultimate of nonviolent weapons. And they're asking their university to divest, and we hope the university will listen to their plea. But we can also ask any university around us to divest. We can ask any group we are in to divest, the organizations we work with or companies we work with, our churches and synagogues and mosques and Quaker meetings should also divest. Our union should divest. And this is something we can really ask them to do and expect them to do. This is a campaign that can actually work. And the last campaign that I want to highlight for you today, before we pause, is a campaign we launched a little bit over a year ago. It is called Apartheid-Free Communities, and it is actually calling on any of your groups and organizations to join a network of communities, mainly in the US, but some are international, that sign on to a pledge. And this is the language of the pledge. You can find it online, apartheid-free.org. And this is a commitment to oppose all forms of racism, bigotry, discrimination, and oppression, declare ourselves apartheid-free, and then to pledge to join others in working to end all support to Israel's apartheid, settler colonialism, and military occupation. This is a pledge. It's a symbolic action. You don't pledge to take any specific action with that. You just pledge to try and join a movement, try and join others in cutting all of our ties to Israeli apartheid. So I will pause here and send it back to Paul for a call to action.
Well, that was tremendous. So much good information, so much horrifying information, and so much inspiring information. So thank you for that. We are going to take questions in just a minute. The way you're going to do it is to go to the reactions button at the bottom of your screen and raise your hand. We'll try to do that as efficiently as possible. Again, we would encourage people to actually ask questions, but it's your 2 minutes. Before doing that, I want to turn this over for a second to Cole Harrison, Executive Director of Massachusetts Peace Action, because tomorrow there's a big vote on aid, military aid to Israel, evidently. Cole, could you tell us about it?
Yeah, Congress is voting on military aid to Israel this week. Actually, as it turned out, the House voted on it tonight. We didn't quite understand when they were going to vote, and it did not pass, and we haven't seen the roll call yet, but I'm quite sure they'll be back. There's a real standoff between Democrats and Republicans on how to get military aid to Israel. They both want to get it to them, but they disagree on other things. In particular, most Republicans don't want to send any more military aid to Ukraine, neither does Napa. They also want to send military aid to Taiwan, and they also want to close the southern border to immigration. So the Senate has a package introduced by Senator Schumer that would do all of those things, and that's what will be up for a cloture vote tomorrow, which is a vote to proceed. It requires 60 votes. It looks like they're not going to get that because Trump is really whipping the Republicans very hard on this immigration issue, saying, don't close the southern border. Just wait until I'm president. Just stop all business in Washington, elect me president, and then I'll close the border even tighter than this compromise that the Democrats already caved and agreed to would do. So it looks like that, may not pass tomorrow, but we need to reach out to our senators, make sure they stand firm against all that aid and above all the aid to Israel, military aid to Israel. And then the House took a separate vote on just Israel aid, and it did not pass, but I'm quite sure they'll be back. There is a majority in both houses of Congress to continue to send military aid to Israel. Our movement is strong, it's growing, but it has not yet reached the point where it has a majority in either house of Congress. So we have to keep pushing, keep demanding, and insist that they vote no on this military aid. So I put a link in the chat. I will put it one more time. Where is my chat? I've lost my window. Glenn, maybe you can bail me out. But and you fill in your details and it will send a message to your 2 US senators and to your House representative. Okay? So thank you very much for that.
Okay, so is that in the chat now, Cole?
Yes, I put it in once, but I'm going to put it in again as soon as I straighten out my windows.
Okay, so when Cole gets that into the chat, if people could actually click on that link now and actually fill out, if you agree with it, fill out that letter to Congress, okay? Is it there yet?
Yeah, it's there.
Okay, great. So if people could click on the link and
We got
please,
230 people here tonight. I'd like to see at least 100 people take that action.
that'd be great.
There's a few of you maybe have, walked away from your computer or something, but all the rest of you should click and send that message, please.
Cole, I'm having trouble finding it. Let's see.
Okay.
Is it? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. I see.
Glenn put it in.
Okay, here it
again.
is from Glenn. Glenn
Yeah.
Cody has just sent it. Okay, so click on that HTTPS link there, and you'll get that form. All you have to do is fill in the blanks with your name and the other information that's requested, and it will go automatically to your members of Congress.
I'm just going to keep making sure it's at the top of the chat window.
Great. Thanks, Glenn. So if people could just take another 30 seconds and do that, that'd be terrific. Okay, I just filling in mine. Well, that's pretty easy. That's quite a system you got there, Cole.
You betcha, the wonders of the internet. Okay,
let us get back to our program. Before you begin, I wanted to say, Dov, if you could give a lot of questions about that book of short stories you mentioned. Could you give that the name of that book again?
Sure. I also put the link in the chat. Here is the book. It's called Light in Gaza, and it is now, the digital version is free on Haymarket Books.
Haymarket Books.
Yeah, you can see it in the chat again. No, I'm just put the link again.
I know. I can't look at both things though. I can't deal with chat and the program at the same time. Okay, looks like, can you get the book in hardcover from Haymarket Books though?
You can get it from Haymarket Books, you'll have to pay, but the digital version is free now.
Great. Okay, well, thanks very much, and let's get into questions here. So we have Daniel Guy. Daniel, could you unmute yourself and ask your question?
He doesn't have permission just yet to do so, so I will now make sure he does. Okay, Daniel, you should be good to unmute.
Now I'm talking. Has anybody thought of comparing the genocide that's occurring in that narrow, isolated Gaza Strip with what happened in 1943 in the Warsaw Ghetto when the Nazis condemned all the Jews there to either fight or hopeless fight or be murdered?
I suggest we take a couple of questions. Maybe we'll take 2 or 3 questions and then we'll, yeah.
Okay, that's good. Thanks for that question, Daniel. Let's go to Elizabeth Fata. Can you get Elizabeth, Glenn?
Elizabeth should now be able to unmute.
Just unmute yourself now, Elizabeth.
I am clicking the ask to unmute button for Elizabeth as diligently as I can, but
Elizabeth, you want to click on that button and then ask your question.
Elizabeth, you might have
Okay.
to put in the
Yeah, I
chat.
got.
There we go. There we go.
There we go.
Yeah. Have you made any comparisons of different politicians who are getting money from these corporations, and could that be published, and how much they're getting? That's my
Okay,
question.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Could we go to those 2 questions first, and then we'll come back for others?
Yeah, I think for the first, I haven't made this comparison. I think it is, speaking as an Israeli Jew myself, I think it is unnecessary because there are so many cases of genocides in the world and so many cases where people were attacked and brutally murdered, mass murdered. So making this specific comparison is possible, I guess. Not my expertise. I'm not a historian. I don't know if any of the other panelists want to say anything about that. As for politicians that receive lobbying support and funding from weapons companies, Noam or Davi,
I can say
this work?
Yeah, I can say we don't track that systematically. We do have on some of the companies, if you go to investigate, we kind of put the links to the companies we discussed. We do have lobbying activities of some of these companies, not for all of them. We mainly track what they the topics they lobby for, not specifically for how they give money to politicians. It's again, like Dov said, it's not part of our ongoing project. We can look into that for specific campaigns if there were any, but our main focus is targeting the companies themselves, trying to get them to change their behavior. And we leave the lobbying Congress and politicians to others. There are so many groups that do that.
And let me just add that it is a fact in US politics, which blows my mind. I'm not a US citizen, and I'm looking at it with horror, how there really isn't anyone speaking against these corporate interests in the House. Really, there are calls in favor or against, sending specific weapons or others, maybe some restrictions, maybe not, but across the board, we don't have a very clear pacifist voice in the House that says that weapons industries are really not promoting our interests.
There is a website called Open Secrets.
Oh, yeah.
That does try to track. It's a difficult thing to do because this money is bundled in different ways and sent through different packs, and all this type of stuff. So, but they do try to do a pretty good job there of listing like the 10 top contributors to various campaigns. And so there is some of that information there. So why don't we move on to the next questions? Could we unmute Karen Ball?
So my question parallels the idea of divestments. So what about targeting the financial capabilities behind these corporations? Is there a way to gain injunctions on the money, so to speak, so that they don't have access to the money?
Okay, let's take one more question. Thank you, Karen. Nija Druby, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, I'm wondering, I mean, you have lots of very good data in here that could be used by the ICJ to prove war crimes. Are you going to be sharing some of that? And how would that happen? Also, is there any way that these companies could then be charged with being complicit? As for the members of Congress, I mean, all they have to do is own some stock in these companies to say, we don't want to stop the war. And that would be legal for them to own it. So is there any way to find out how many shares they own?
Wait, those are some good questions. What do you
Wow.
what do you three
Yeah.
think?
Yeah, these are really excellent. Thank you. Let's start with Najla's question, because we definitely have met with several UN bodies with the results of our research. There is a UN working group on business and human rights. There is a commission of inquiry that was set up by the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights to look into the events of this last 4 months. There is a special rapporteur that was appointed by the UN into looking into the situation in the occupied Palestinian territory. So we tried sending everybody the results of our research. We just send it around. We want as many of these bodies to see it and to use it as they can. In general, the International Court of Justice, of course, is only putting states on the only charging states, not individuals, not corporations. On the other hand, once the judgment is out that there is a risk of genocide and there is a call from the International Court of Justice asking Israel and others not to contribute to genocide and to prevent genocide, then of course it is the obligation of corporations as well as other states as well as individuals not to contribute to genocide. And this is where I think potentially corporations can be put on trial in the International Criminal Court, for example, as supporting of genocide. This could be a next step, and I hope that this will be done. So these are my thoughts about this question. I don't know. Let's see if Davi or Noam, you want to say anything about the ICJ and complicity of companies, or?
I can just add, doing this work in the United States is very difficult. All the suggestions that people have are excellent, and we don't really have the political power in the United States to do a lot. Like Dov said, in Congress, there's a consensus around militarism. There's no real champion for pacifism or for nonviolent action. So I know that actions that have been taken in other countries, for example, activists in Australia and the Netherlands have sued companies and tried to sue companies for delivering parts of weapons to Israel, not even the main platforms, not the main weapon systems. And in the United States, there's very little ability to do that because of the structures of US law and because really we are in a tiny minority of people who are expecting that. So I think the International Criminal Court maybe is the only avenue, like Dov said, to put American corporations on trial for that. We tried with Caterpillar. Caterpillar was sued years ago, and the lawsuit was not successful as well.
Great.
And then maybe I would move to the other question by Karen about divestment.
Yeah.
We all know that some of these corporations are huge. Lockheed Martin is as big as several states. It's not even a company. I would call it a country. So I think that the right strategy is not to think how do we target them and destroy them. We cannot. We as a movement, that's not what we have at hand. And also, it's very hard to expose and limit their political support at this point. They offer jobs in so many states around the country. So many politicians are afraid to speak out against them. What divestment can do is make it more public to see their webs of support and to try and isolate their political influence. That's what divestment can do. It doesn't really work as an economic tool. It doesn't really take away from these companies' direct funding, and it doesn't take away from these companies' share price. It doesn't do that. What it does is to try and isolate their social and economic relationships. So I don't know, Davi, if you want to say something about the connections of your alma mater with RTX, but it's like we vow as a community, just like you saw with apartheid-free communities, to cut our ties with these corporations. And we start with our own ties, and we go into our institutional ties around us, and we go into investments. There was a wave of divesting from the weapons industries back in the 70s and 80s. It's time for a new such wave, identifying those investments and making sure that our pension funds and all sorts of public funds and state funds are not invested in these companies, and having that debate out in the open, saying these companies don't support our shared good. They don't support our communities. They don't support our well-being. They just create death. That's their business, death. So that's how I think about divestment. I don't know.
Okay, great. Davi, did you want to mention anything on that?
Yeah, just echo what Dove said a bit. Noam and I actually share the same alma mater, Northeastern, which is right down the road from Raytheon RTX's former headquarters in Waltham. The university actually has an auditorium named after RTX. It sends its students on co-op programs, which are 6-month long to a year long full-time jobs at companies like RTX, like Lockheed Martin, like Boeing, to become tomorrow's weapons manufacturers. So I know we look to Congress, we look to our politicians as those that hold all the power, and while to an extent true, there's also power to be found on local university campuses within our own communities. I mean, these companies, their reach is insidious. It's not just in the halls and rooms, closed doors of politicians. They're local, they're in our backyard. So there's a struggle and a fight to be had in our local communities too.
Great, thank you, Davi. Before we get to Jeffrey's question, I want to ask you all to tell people what resources are available to them. If someone wants to find out what Lockheed, say Lockheed is in their backyard, what piece of information do you have that they can go to? I've seen a lot of tremendous resources you have. Even this slideshow. Is this slideshow something that's available on your website, or is this something that's copyrighted that you're going to make a lot of money off of and all that type of thing?
Yeah.
So could you just tell us what resources people can get to, because these companies are all over the place.
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, the list of companies involved right now in attacks in Gaza is on our website, and we put many of these links in the chat, and we can also send it to you later, Paul, if you want to share it with anybody who signed up for this webinar. We also have the database Investigate. You can go and read a lot more about each one of these companies, Lockheed Martin or Raytheon or Caterpillar, and what we know, everything we know about them. You can find we have hundreds of pages on this database, Investigate, where you can read an in-depth profile about each one of these companies. When it comes to local campaigns, if students in Northeastern want to run a campaign in order to cut some ties with RTX, they can contact us and we will try and help them do the local research and find out more, because of course it's not all available out there already. But we do try and help local activists in finding good strategic targets around them.
Great. But you can, if you want a particular company, you can get a list of the weapons that company makes for, not just in general, but for Israel.
Definitely. I would really recommend our main project, investigate.info online. You just put in the company's name and it pops up a page with everything we know about the company. Here, Davi put the list again in the chat. Try it out. Even on your phone, it should work. The same website also includes an investor screening tool. So if you are invested in a mutual fund, or if you have a list of holdings, or if you know what your church or meeting is invested in, you can just upload that list or put the name of the fund into the tool, and it will tell you what is your exposure to the issues that we track on this tool.
Okay, great. Is that slideshow that you gave some of those slides on your website anywhere?
The slideshow is not, but it was mainly just illustrative visuals. The links are what matters, and we can definitely share those.
Okay, and so everyone who registered for tonight's webinar will be getting an email over the next couple of days with some of these links, okay? If you can't keep track of them, which I can't right now. And you'll have those in your on your email, and you can check out some of this stuff. You will be amazed at some of the information that is available, that people have been asking for a long time, and now it is available to us. So when you get that email, be sure to look into some of this stuff. And I'll just mention that the Raytheon campaign here in the Boston area is doing a lot of actions, rallies calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. And what we do is try to take advantage of the fact that these companies are all over us, that all of us are connected to them in one way or another, either geographically or through investments or whatever. And it's a good way of letting all of us constantly remember that we are involved in this. That these companies are the ones killing Palestinians. So if we're interested in stopping the murder of Palestinians, we don't have to go very far to find out the agencies responsible. In fact, of course, these military companies have far more influence than any group of congressmen. And this is where the power is in the country. And so it's excellent to use these targets for nonviolent actions that raise the issue of a ceasefire in Gaza. Just constantly use that to focus on what our demands are. And what I'm going to do is once more, and I'm sorry, Jeffrey, I'm going to ask you in just a second. I'm going to put once more in the chat some links to not just where is it here? Not just your website, but the sign-up sheet for the Raytheon campaign, if you'd like to join us in Boston. There we go. Please, if you're interested in participating in these actions calling for a ceasefire and highlighting the weapons that Raytheon is making, please join us. We do rallies every 2 weeks, and we try to participate in bigger rallies, of course, all the time. So those 3 links will lead you. Please, if you are interested, that last link is to the sign-up sheet for what's called the Raytheon Nuclear Weapons Campaign, but it's actually the one we're using for the Gaza campaign. So if you could fill that out, that would be great. And finally, Jeffrey, Glenn, could we unmute Jeffrey so he could ask his question?
Yes, Jeffrey, you should unmute now.
Thank you. I got 3 quick ones real quick. Okay, first off, here's something I put in the chat box that should also be beneficial. If you know what I mean. And secondly, I'm also doing something too. I'm writing letters. I'm writing letters to
Please ask your question, Jeffrey.
religious leaders.
Okay.
And here, religious leaders about this whole thing, all that. And thirdly, my question. Something about this war doesn't make sense. I know Israel. If the war didn't start, Benjamin Netanyahu would have been charged for his corruption, but Hamas was the one who fired the first shot. Correct. So, did we actually bait? We actually bait them into attacking Israel purposely? Is that
Okay,
that's my
okay? Thanks, Jeffrey. There's a question for us.
Yeah, I think we should take into account that the public attention to what is going on far off in Palestine ebbs. Yes, sometimes there is a lot of attention, sometimes there is very little attention. But as you heard today from Noam, the attacks on Gaza are never stopping. Every year or two, there is a big attack. And there are constant attacks. Gaza has been under a military siege for 16 years. Fishermen and farmers near the borders or trying to get out to sea were constantly attacked. Israel continuously controls all the flow of goods and electricity into the besieged Gaza Strip that has over 2 million people in it. They don't have a freedom of movement. Israel controls the population registry. So this is not peace. The fact that we haven't heard about it doesn't mean that there was peace. And the Palestinian militant factions inside the Gaza Strip, Hamas being one of them, have tried to conduct attacks against Israel before, and this is not new. They had a huge military success on October 7 when they managed to take over several dozen Israeli towns and kill Israeli civilians and conduct great damage, including sexual violence, and take hostages. It's quite horrifying, and it is definitely a game changer, but it is on a principle level not that they started it. The escalation in violence in Palestine has been going on for decades, ever since the formation of the State of Israel in 1948 and the creation of the refugee problem. And of course, most Palestinians in the Gaza Strips are refugees from that war, from the 1948 war, that are not allowed to go back to their homes inside Israel, to their former property, and so on. So who started it is really not the right question. As for Netanyahu, his trial is ongoing, and is still ongoing through the war, and it has been ongoing for some years, for several different cases of corruption, and we all hope that he will leave office soon. And but I don't think that him leaving office will change things dramatically, because the conflict with the Palestinians, including the ongoing war and oppression and occupation and colonialism and apartheid, has started before his time in office.
Yeah. Okay, well, as the host, I'm going to get the last question here, because it's building off the question that Jeffrey just asked. A lot of people, in reference to the brutality of the October 7th action by Hamas, say, well, why, I understand why people would protest the unlivable conditions that they live in, but why use such violence? And I wonder if one of you could talk about it was in your slideshow, Noam, the nonviolent march back a few years ago, and what that was about and what happened.
The nonviolent march, it was a series of marches actually. In 2018, a Palestinian poet named Ahmed Abartema wrote a poem on Facebook asking what would happen if thousands of us marched peacefully to the war, meaning the war between Gaza and Israel. And some people took it on, and in a series of demonstrations every Friday for several months, thousands of Palestinians marched to the wall, had large gatherings with families and children, and protested the existence of the wall. Ahmed called it. He said it's like prisoners knocking on the walls of their prison cell. It's like the only thing they can do. And the Israeli response was brutal. I mean, Israel deployed snipers to the Israeli side of the wall, and they deliberately targeted who they thought were the leaders. Anyone with a bullhorn or anyone they thought was directing things, and they shot at their kneecaps. So there were hundreds of people. I don't remember the exact numbers, but people became maimed for life for peacefully protesting their captivity. This went on for several months until Israel won. Basically, the protest just died off because people could not sustain it. And again, we saw the same. Some of the same companies are profiled on Investigate because of their participation. Some of the drones that are used now, for example, the drone that I showed that Israel now equips with lethal weapons, that was the first use of that drone when they put smoke grenade canisters on the same drone, the DJI drone that we saw earlier in the pictures, and it would drop smoke grenades on the demonstrators from above. So, history rhymes there too a little bit. I hope I answered your question.
You did. Thank you, Noam. I just want to point out that what was the reaction of the international community to that incredible nonviolence action? Almost silence. Almost silence. If the reaction that is taking place today over October 7th had happened then, we would be in a very different place. But the Palestinians gave that nonviolence a big try there.
I want to add
It
just,
didn't come through.
Paul, if I may, I just want to add that I cannot speak for Palestinians, but I started my activism in Israel learning from Palestinian nonviolent peace activists. My journey as an activist was always following the leadership of very powerful nonviolent activists, mostly in the West Bank. I never worked with people in Gaza. And their courage and their persistence and their generosity of heart is ongoing. It is not a one-time thing. You see the Great March of Return in Gaza as a huge source of inspiration, but this is ongoing. And there are still nonviolent demonstrations going on in the West Bank, inviting Israelis in trying to prevent the destruction of more and more communities in the West Bank today and in the last few weeks from settler attacks and military attacks. And the Israeli reaction is the reaction of any empire. Any empire with tremendous power backed by the United States with total impunity, total legal and diplomatic and economic support allows them to crush the resistance, crush. They take on individual leaders of the nonviolent resistance and they crush them, crush their lives. They imprison them forever. They take away their livelihood. They persecute their children. They make their life hell. And they make them into example, one after the other, after the other, after the other. At the same time, Palestinian resistance always also had a militant faction. And I don't stand for this faction, and I will never justify this faction because I am a pacifist. I do not think it is a good thing to kill people. And Hamas was also bombing buses in 2003 and 2004, where I lived in Jerusalem and then in Tel Aviv. People were blown up around me. That didn't justify killing Rachel Corrie at the same time in Gaza. Violence never justifies violence and never, ever, ever stops violence. What we're asking you today is to take responsibility as Americans, because this is not something that is happening back there. We are complicit here in the United States of America because none of it could have continued for so long without the US support for Israel. What can we do to stop it? What can we do to hold those politicians accountable, those corporations accountable, to cut our ties to whatever extent we can? This is what we need to do. Israel could not have continued bombing Gaza for 4 months without getting more and more and more ammunition and weapons from the United States. And now they're going to vote for $14 billion in more arms to Israel. Unbelievable, $14 billion. You can kill a lot more people with that. So I'm not saying my country, Israel, is not totally responsible here, absolutely responsible here. But let's do what we can from here to stop that support.
Okay, thank you, Dov, for that. And thank all three of you for joining us tonight. Hopefully, more of us will make use of the resources. We should learn more about this apartheid-free community movement and have the Mass Peace Action Gaza campaign consider that as a tactic. And AFSC, we thank AFSC for all its work in Gaza. AFSC had people in Gaza. I don't know if, I assume they've had to leave if they're still alive. They're still there. So when it comes to Israel-Palestine issues, American Friends Service Committee, as a national organization, has been investing in this since the 1970s, has paid the price for it with bricks thrown through windows and things like that. But it was the first organization to really take this on in a serious way. And it's great to see AFSC continuing that work. And if people are looking for places to donate AFSC's humanitarian programs in Gaza, you can count on those being very as effective as it's possible for them to be anyway. So thank you all three. Thank you for our audience very, very much. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your concern. And obviously, this is the time to make sure that that this time change comes about, that this time we don't drop the ball, but see this through to the end until Palestinians have their rights restored to them that they are insisting on every single day. Thank you all. Good night. Thanks a lot to Glenn Goatee for the technology on this. Glenn, thanks a million. Good to see you, Cole. Good to see everyone else. And keep in mind the other upcoming webinars with the dissenters and the rallies on Palestine and on Ukraine coming up in the Boston area and of course around the country. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone. I'm about to close the Zoom room.
Good night, Glenn.
Sleep well. Thank you for taking action for peace. Have a great night, everybody.